Okay, great. Welcome to Beyond Nations Forum. In these forums, we're going to be discussing various issues concerning minority rights, citizenship rights, human rights, from people from all over the world who are experts on their areas. And we hope that people will engage with these topics to learn from each other, to understand these topics a little bit better, and really to create a dialogue with people from different parts of the world, so we can all engage on these issues and open a dialogue. Today's forum is about lessons on conflict resolution from Pakistan's tribal areas. And we have two experts on this topic. We have Mr. Imtiaz Gul, who is the Executive Director of the Center for Research and Security Studies. He's also the editor-in-chief of Matrix magazine, which is a monthly magazine in Pakistan, and is the author of several publications on various issues, peace, conflict relating to Pakistan. And we also have Dr. Farooq Yousaf, who has completed a PhD from the University of Newcastle in Australia, concerning the Pakistan tribal areas and post-colonial issues there, and is also the author of various publications in various academic journals on the same topic. I want to really launch into this straight away and really get an understanding to the introduction to this topic. And if I can go to you, Mr. Gul, if you could begin by just explaining for the audience a little bit about the federally administered tribal areas. What are they, and how did they come to exist?
Well, the federally administered tribal areas basically was a small strip, about 27,000 square kilometers, which actually had been created by the British rulers sometime in the late 18th century. This was a zone, this was a region where a number of tribals, ethnic Pashtun tribes lived, and they refused to basically concede to any alien rulers or invaders. So then the British rulers at that time entered into an agreement with the Afghan king, saying that, okay, we'll leave these areas unattended, let the tribes live the way they want. And they called them the federally administered tribal areas. In 1947, once the British left, after the creation of Pakistan, these areas remained as the FATAs, as they were used to be known. And basically, they were just with a single sentence added into the constitution of Pakistan. Other than that, there were no laws, no constitution, no rights for the people living there. And they were free to do anything. And these were the rights given to these people by the British rulers, and Pakistan also did not pay any attention to these areas until particularly the 9/11 happened.
Okay, so just give us a little bit of insight into what level of population live there. I mean, what type of people live there? How many people live there? Is it a diverse area?
Yeah, most of this 27,000 square kilometer region is very rugged, barren, and a number of Pashtun tribes live there. The entire terrain is very inhospitable, and that's why people there don't have much to do except indulging in trade, cross-border trade, which the Pakistani authorities called smuggling, because basically no rules applied. So it was an irony that in the 21st century, there was a region which was part of a country, but until very recently, that the law of the land did not apply to that part of the country. And the government was extended only on the border, as well as 50 meters or 50 feet both sides of the road that went through, that connected the cities of Pakistan with the border region. So the local economy primarily has been trading. That also included drug and arms trafficking. This is what the British ruler had allowed the tribes to trade in.
You mentioned earlier up until 9/11. What was the significance of 9/11 for this area? What happened and what changed?
Well, much before 9/11, when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan back in December 1979, and the Americans, together with some other NATO countries, decided to respond to the Russian invasion. So they used this tribal area, this FATA area, as a launching pad for attacking the Soviet and the Afghan national forces. So it became a hotbed of militancy. In those days, it was a positive militancy in the early and mid 80s because the Americans were supporting it. And then gradually it also turned into a hotbed of religious extremism, just because it was a handy tool for the Americans as well as for the Pakistani state apparatus to utilize them, to use them inside Afghanistan against the Russians. And then obviously, once in February 1989, the Russians left Afghanistan, the Americans also turned their back on the region, leaving the entire area to Pakistan. And Pakistan had its own motives in retaining the special status of these regions. So it continued to thrive in, number one, religious extremism, number two, in arms and drugs trades. Not really much was done to that until the 9/11 happened, when, again, the area became the launch pad for all sort of counterterrorism operations led by the United States.
Okay. So can you develop a little bit on how the United States then used this region post 9/11? What was the significance of it, and what developed afterwards, after 9/11?
Well, the United States co-opted the Pakistani intelligence as well as army for guarding the border regions, and border regions obviously were these federally administered tribal areas. And there was a lot of back and forth of Pakistani and the foreign troops. Basically, most of the cargo, whether it was the food or the armaments for the NATO and American troops inside Afghanistan, flew through the tribal regions, which we call the FATA. And it also became sort of a center for all the Al-Qaeda, all the Afghan Taliban militants who had fled from Afghanistan. They came and camped in the FATA areas. They used it for attacks inside Afghanistan, for training, for planning attacks. So it became the command and control center for the entire Al-Qaeda-led opposition to the United States.
What were the consequences of this for the ordinary people who lived there? You know, we often talk about this area in the context of these big sort of geopolitical interests: Al-Qaeda, Al-Taliban, the US. What was going on in terms of the ordinary people's lives? How were they dealing with this era?
Yeah, the ordinary people actually went through a turmoil, went through an upheaval, because I have been talking to a lot of people since 2001, 2002 in the tribal areas, and these guys were earlier fed on a narrative that said that all the Islamic militants were our friends because they were at that time fighting the Russians. But now these guys were flabbergasted a little bit, because it's a very typical conservative medieval mindset which considers shift in positions as betrayal. So once the Pakistan army decided to launch its operations together with the American troops and guidance, these guys thought they had been betrayed, because they were now required or supposed to hunt the same people who they had been advised to protect and embrace as their partners in the fight against the Russians. Now these people thought that they were being used as instruments for killing the same people, regardless regardless of the merit of their thinking. But this is how Pakistan encountered a lot of problems. It was seen as attacking its own people, mounting this aggression against the tribes which had been serving as the guardians of the frontier to the northwest. But then all of a sudden, they saw a huge paradigm shift in the Pakistani military's calculus, which now told them that Al-Qaeda is an enemy. and all the affiliates, whether Afghan or Pakistani, they're also equally our enemy, so they have to be taken out. And this bred a lot of resentment, frustration, and also it gave birth to a lot of reaction, violent reaction, which then fed into various segments of the society. So it also proliferated into the mosques, for instance, where usually the mullah has the day, so he can basically propagate a lot of anti-American, anti-West propaganda. And then a lot of people got inspired. So as a whole, these people, this region has gone through a massive turmoil, a massive shift. The frustration also flew from the fact that for quite some time, for nearly 7 decades, these guys had no constitutional rights. They were living under a draconian set of laws, which the British had introduced back in 1901, or probably also beginning with the 1873. So under those laws, these guys could do anything, could run any business. However, they were collectively responsible for any misdeed that the local federal authority would hold them responsible for. So there was a sense of a law of collective responsibility. So if something happens in your area, then the entire tribe is held responsible. There was no recourse to law, no recourse to any court. So the local administrator, the so-called deputy commissioner, we used to call him the political agent, he was the uncrowned king of the area. So once he would say something, order something, it had to be complied with. There was no second opinion about it. So if he throws you in the jail without assigning any reason, you can stay there for years, because there was no law that governed an arbitrary action or that provided any mitigation for the arbitrary action of a government official.
You talked about this idea of betrayal and the consequences of that. You know, some of us might have read about the struggle between some of the players in this region and the Pakistani military. You know, the military itself has been in conflict with this region. Can you talk about who were the key kind of players in this confrontation, and how did that confrontation play out between these two positions?
Well, it's a long story. You know, what we had seen as a result of the Soviet invasion and the American response to it, the emergence of religio-political extremist parties, both inside of Pakistan as well as in Afghanistan. So a number of people, the so-called Mujahideen, they went on to become the Taliban in the mid-90s after the Soviet Union had retreated, the Americans had turned away from Afghanistan, and factional fighting or civil war had begun in Afghanistan. So the morphing of Mujahideen into the Taliban basically was looked at as an opportunity by the Pakistani establishment, which thought that this is primarily an ethnic Pashtun force, which might be very friendly to Pakistan itself. So that's why they reached out to the Taliban, provided them also recognition in 1996, together with the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia. They recognized them as the legitimate government of Afghanistan. And this is how these guys then became also an inspiration, on the one hand, for a lot of Pakistani militant organizations, on the other hand, a shelter, an umbrella for the Al-Qaeda militants who had been camping or hiding inside Afghanistan. So they, a number of groups also, new groups emerged. So as a whole, you can say that Afghanistan became a hotbed of religious militancy under the Afghan Taliban. And at that time, Pakistan considered it convenient to be cooperating with them, to be collaborating with the Afghan Taliban, because they were not averse to Pakistan, without realizing that the long-term implications were increased religiosity in Pakistan, increased militancy, this violent extremist thought that, you know, that was a consequence of this conflation of political power as well as religious beliefs, together with an extremely conservative medieval tribal mindset.
So it sounds like there is so many different problems, different factors. There's the British colonial legacy, there's the Soviet issue, there's the US war on terror issue, there's the disparate kind of militias, there's this conflict with the state. I want to kind of figure out how these conflicts can be resolved and what efforts have been made so far. And so perhaps I could turn to Dr. Yousaf. We've heard that recently the FATA area has been, in a way, incorporated into the Pakistani state. Can you tell us how that has come about and what the consequences have been?
Actually, after the Pakistani army's like a long list of operations and the demands from the locals, the state and the government also realized that like on the back of military operations, the region was supposed to be mainstreamed with the KP province, and the rationale or the idea like with that was actually the locals had demanded that the region was supposed to get the rights which were equal compared to the rest of the country. So in 2018, at the end of the month of May, the Parliament, the National Assembly, passed a resolution, and they also approved an amendment to mainstream the tribal areas. The state also realized that in order to consolidate the military operations and the benefits of all those operations, it was about a time to mainstream the region. And like it was also one of the reasons that peace has been somewhat restored in the region, and with the mainstreaming and with the access to justice and access to policing, the state and the governments can ensure that the gains of all the military operations can be consolidated further.
I mean, you talked about the demands from the people who lived there. What other conditions would you say have been necessary for this incorporation to take place? What needed to have happened for this type of resolution to have been achieved?
So as we heard from Mr. Gul, the FCR, which was like implemented until the region was mainstreamed, it sort of left the region in the isolation. So the locals did not have any access to courts. They had not have any access to health. They had not have access to education. And to compound and to elevate all the issues, the US invasion in Afghanistan also increased the problems in the region. And with that, the locals were actually forced to leave their homes because of the military operations and the US drone strikes and also militancy. So ultimately, the locals were also sort of fed up of all the circumstances and all the isolation, which also ultimately helped the locals to demand the mainstreaming of their region.
There's one element of conflict resolution which is led by the state. You know, you talked about the National Assembly passing this resolution, incorporating tribal areas into the rest of Pakistan. But what about from the sort of ground level? What type of mechanisms are necessary for there to be resolution between these very deep and historic senses of betrayal? How do people in this area come to agree on peace on a social level?
The Pashtuns actually have an important and integral element uh, of peace and all the conflict resolution. They also follow their own indigenous mechanisms of jirga. It's also an extremely old
what is a jirga?
mechanism.
If you could tell us
So
what a
it's
jirga
actually, so it's actually a council of elders. They sit in a circle and then I negotiate, I mediate, and then I decide about all their issues. Jirgas are also responsible to form what they call lashkars or militias. So lashkars are actually militias of the Pashtuns, which are actually responsible to enforce the decisions of the Jirgas. And in certain circumstances, the Lashkars are also responsible to protect their regions and the areas. So in the last 18 to 19 years, we saw that when the locals also realized that all militants were the enemy, they formed Lashkars to fight against all the militants and the groups.
Can I? Yes, please.
Yeah, basically, once faced with radical militancy led by Al Qaeda in 2003, the Pakistani government responded with two strategies, two ways of conflict resolution. One was the hard way, that is military, with the deployment of military and going for kinetic operations together with the Americans. The other one was two-pronged. One was JEGA, as Dr. Farooq is saying. JEGA is the meeting, assembly of local elders whenever there's a problem. The other one was Lashkar, as he said. The Lashkars were meant for not only for the security, but also for neutralizing the enemy, neutralizing the threat. So it was a combination of soft power, traditional soft power, as well as traditional hard power. So they experimented with that for quite some time until they realized, the military realized in 2010-11 that this is not going to work, and then eventually military power was deployed because the Al-Qaeda-led militants as well as terrorist organizations, the TTP being one of them, they had started attacking not only Lashkars, the traditional militia, local militia, but also the Jirgas. Wherever there would be a Jirga, so there were many instances in which these assemblies and the militias came under attack. So the conclusion that the state of Pakistan drew was that the only way now to deal with them was to use the hard power. And this is what then began happening in most of the tribal areas, particularly in 2014, when the military went in a big way in Waziristan region, which is the largest region among the ex-FATA agencies. And here the massive deployment of the army and deployment of, in fact, the aviation as well, it helped then minimize or decapitate the TTP and Al-Qaeda leadership together with the CIA-led drones. So as a whole, I think the traditional, when the traditional mechanism for conflict resolution failed, the hard power came in. And now, following the mainstreaming of the entire region through the 17th amendment in May 2017, we are now seeing the emergence of new structures, new political structures, and also which will more hopefully help in conflict resolution in the medium to long run.
What would you say has been the relevance of the new government in Pakistan? We know that the Imran Khan's party succeeded in the last election. They're now in government. Have they been taking a different approach to previous governments? If so, what is the different approach, and has that been useful?
Well, the PTI government has not really any direct approach. It was not responsible for it. It's primarily the Pakistan military which has led the entire operation, which sanitized, so to say, the area from hardcore terrorists and militants. And the only thing that the PTI has done is to increase the health cover to the entire ex-FATA region. It has also launched, together with the military, some welfare schemes. It has helped revive the local economy. So there's a number of small steps that this government has taken, and that's why it emerged as the largest party also in the ex-FATA regions when local government elections were held there. So one would hope that both the military as well as the civilian forces move in tandem to consolidate the gains from the kinetic operations that have been taking place in the region for quite some time.
If I could ask both of you in turn, upon reflection of all of the conflict that has been happening over the last decades and where they've got to now, what would you say are the lessons that can be learned, not just for Pakistan, but generally in terms of conflict resolution? What are the key aspects to achieving peace that you could say can be taken from this whole era?
Yeah, maybe Farooq could take
maybe, yes, Dr. Yousaf, do you want to, what are the key lessons that we can take from this?
For me, the biggest lesson is that the state has to look after the interests of its own people. Because initially, as Ms. Gul was saying, and he also explained that the state in the 70s and also after the US invasion was unsure about the strategy and the policy. Finally, when the state ultimately realized that it had to look after its own interest of people, it was successful in sort of establishing a writ and a peace as well. So that, for me, is the biggest learning.
Okay. And Mr. Gul, would you add to that, or anything else you would say about what's the main lessons that we can take from this?
Well, I think the Pakistani state as a whole learned a very bitter lesson in a very hard way. It was that the longer you deny fundamental rights to a particular region where people feel deprived, the more the chance of conflict, the more the chance of radicalization, and the greater the chance of a violent reaction. So I think 2017 was landmark in the history of this country, as well as in the history of the former tribal areas, when both the military and the civilian government basically decided to mainstream those areas and remove some very legitimate grievances of the local people, which had been reeling from the British colonial era laws. There were basically no laws. So that was a set of decrees which made the local authorities as the undisputed kings, and they basically could dictate people around. So the lesson was that the second lesson I would say was that the conflicts can be set aside, resolved only through dialogue, only through extension of the writ of the state, and only through working on the soft power of the state. Hard power doesn't guarantee you an enduring success in a very complicated backward, and disadvantaged region.
And final question, again, if I could ask both of you in turn. Are you hopeful for the region? Can lasting peace now be achieved? And if so, what makes you hopeful? Again, Dr. Yousaf.
So I'm extremely hopeful, even though some issues are still like in the way of like establishing long-term peace. But the reason that I'm actually hopeful is that the state finally realized that it had to abolish the FCR, and it also mainstream the region. So on the other hand, we've also witnessed that situation in Afghanistan is also somewhat improving, so which will also have an impact on the tribal areas. So if Afghanistan is stable, the tribal areas will automatically remain stable. And like we should actually hope that with the mainstreaming, we are also able to abolish the term like a tribal, because it's a very backward, like connotations of a word are extreme backward. So let's hope that with the mainstreaming and with the access to justice and to education and also to health, tribal areas can no longer known as tribal areas.
Great. And Mr. Gul, are you hopeful?
Yeah, I'm an optimist by nature. I remain hopeful. However, one should also keep in mind that Pakistan has been suffering as a whole from poor governance, and the tribal areas or former tribal areas more so. The mainstreaming is not going to be easy. It's a very painful process. We shall have to develop administrative capacities, security capacities in those areas. It will take time. It will not be without hiccups. But I, as a Pakistani, am very happy that finally we got rid of the aberration which used to be called the Frontier Crimes Regulation and federally administered tribal areas, and they are now equal citizens and equal parts of the mainland Pakistan.
Great. Well, both, thank you very much. Been really insightful, and I hope that there's been lessons that can apply not only to this area, but hopefully to other conflicts around the world. There's issues, colonial history issues, these great empires vying for power in these areas. There's issues to do with health, access to education, access to courts, and also how soft power and hard power are different. And ultimately what the role of the state is. So both, thank you very much. And we hope that we'll be able to speak to you again on a later edition of a Beyond Nations Forum. And thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Bye-bye.